the results were announced today. Just give out your feeling, and before then you can respond to we can go around the room, just your reaction to today's announcement that the president-elect is Mr. Joe Biden. Jackie, let's start with you.
Oh, okay. Well, obviously, I'm very excited. I think it has brought in a new era of hope. The last time I was on this program, we talked about, I spoke about the common good. And I said that the common good is a community of nations that get together to strengthen each other. And that the president, that was at the time Trump, that he saw the common good as something to be laughed at in the world as an arena where you fight and may the best man win. So I think the common good has righted itself. The people have spoken. And I'm very excited for this new era in the world.
Jusu, your reaction?
Well, it's the unofficial result, and I think we should continue to see it just like that until, like I first said, when the first time I appeared, I think like a week ago, it's not over until it is over. So until we get the official result, people can unofficially rejoice until the official result can come in. So there have been a lot going on and we'll discuss it along the line as we go. But right now, it's just an unofficial result. That's how I see it. So,
Carl, your reaction?
Well, I think that this has been the first election in the entire history of the United States where Southern states, especially since African Americans have had suffrage, the right to vote. This has been the first election in the history of the state of Georgia where the voter suppression of Black votes has been at a minimum. And it's documented that this is, I mean, even 4 years ago, there was rampant voter suppression of African American votes in this very state where I live. And this is the very first election where that was not allowed. And we owe that to a lot of people, including the governor who participated in voter suppression 4 years ago, somehow got a conscience and diverted or separated himself from the tradition of Southern conservatives and allowed African Americans in the state of Georgia the full rights of citizenship for the first time in the entire history of this state. And I will talk about that some more later. But for me, that's the greatest victory of all of this. And if they had voted for Trump, if they had voted for Biden, is not as significant or as consequential for me as the fact that their votes were counted. And I'm actually very proud to be alive at this time in history.
Thank you so much. And that's your initial reaction. Mr. Sear, sorry for the interruption. Back to you.
Mr. Ja, I think that interruption was very much necessary. This victory, as I tried to say earlier, is a victory for democracy and all those who cherish democracy a whole lot. We saw something almost for the past 4 years now that we have never seen in the history of America. And so for us to see this massive turnout of voters in my state of Minnesota, we're talking about 80%. That has never happened before. And so it is something worth celebrating. And I just hope that democracy around the world or other countries around the world that are practicing democracy, their voters will do the same. And that's the best things to do to give people the opportunity to vote and for their voices to be heard. So having said that, let's get to it. We stay talking election, we're talking democracy. What happened before election, during election, and after election? So before election, to you panelists, we see the primaries are held. We see debates, then we see the campaign. So all these three major things happen during the election cycle. What did we learn or what did we see during that election period? And how can we apply those to Liberia? And this time I'm going to start with you, Mrs. Formula.
So I think for the biggest lesson I think we can pull out of this as Liberians is the importance of maintaining our direct democracy.
Okay.
A lot of times people compare, well, we think that Liberia is modeled after the US federal government. The fact is Liberia is actually modeled off of a state government. So we have counties instead of states, we have a strong central authority, and we have a direct democracy. So we elect our presidents the way the states in the United States elect their governors. Each vote counts equally, no matter which county you live in. It's inconsequential. And I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that, in my opinion, our system is more democratic. It is a better system in that the popular vote determines who the president is. Where in the United States, you have this history of Southern states trying to push for state rights, so that the Electoral College was born out of that process, so that the Southern states, which were less populated with voters, could still affect, control, or have more influence over who the president is. And so that played out throughout history of the United States when it came to trying to maintain or conserve slavery and segregation. And so in the United States, when we talk about the election of the head of state, of the president, it is the states that really elect the president, not individuals. And that's a very important distinction. So I hear a lot of Liberians talking about, oh, we need an electoral college. I think that is an absolute disaster. I think it's wrong. And I think that our system of electing the head of state, however flawed, is definitely the ideal when we talk about democracy.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. That is a very important point you made there. And that is a huge difference between our system of democracy and how it's being practiced here in the US. Let me come to you, Jackie. If you wish, you can comment on what Mrs. Formula said, but we are looking at primaries, debates, and campaign. The way these things are done in the US, are they done differently in Liberia, or are they done better here and not better in Liberia? What can we learn from the way they are done here, and how can we improve those in Liberia?
I think, Dennis, Anthony, I'm sorry, that there are three things we can learn. When I was last on, I spoke about the silent majority. Remember, I said that those who were not polled, right? They never went on talk shows. They just waited to vote. We saw that on election day. I would say that Liberia has three things to learn from this process. The first is the power of the people. We, the people, is a very powerful phrase. And I think that we as Liberians, we don't know that yet. I don't think we know that this one vote that we have is so powerful that it is the only time we get to have a say in how we want our country to run. The second one I would say is the power of institutions. If the United States did not have strong institutions, I think that what we would have seen would be more of a disaster than what happened. So the institutions, and I would try to bring in Levitsky's book, How Democracies Die, to say about soft, right? Soft guardrails. We have guardrails, right? We have the Constitution. The soft guardrails that would protect these institutions are the accepted norms of behavior, those unwritten rules that people follow, right? That unwritten contract that say you may disagree with me, but I expect you to act within the bounds of what is normal, right? I expect you not to subvert the Constitution, not to weaponize the courts, and not to weaponize the institutions. I think the third thing would be the power of the Constitution. You know, the Constitution is a very powerful document, and I think that we saw it in play in this thing. You know, people forget. You know, all the time we talk about Constitution, and people put a lot of power in the Constitution. But you must also strengthen the institution. People forget that New Zealand, Britain, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Libya, they have no constitution, no written constitution. People that, oh, Britain has, no, Britain does not. What they have is the 1215 Magna Carta. Then they have the 1689 Bill of Rights. But they have these rules. The Magna Carta forced the king to set up a parliamentary system of government that had the right to assemble, free speech, and free access to the courts. So when we're talking about the lesson Liberia should learn, I think the first lesson is the people of Liberia are very powerful, more powerful than they know. The second one is that the institutions need to be protected at all costs. And when I say institutions, I just don't mean the established ones. I mean the code of conduct, the mode of how you govern yourself, those unwritten rules. And I will say the third one, and this one is very important. A lot of time we talk about, oh, we want decentralization in Liberia. That is all well and good to have decentralization, to have the superintendent chosen by each county. But decentralization cannot work without devolution. Devolution is to give them power. You can decentralize and still the superintendent will have to report to the president, you know, but you saw devolution in play when you saw all these separate states in the United States saying, no, we're going to continue counting. We're going to continue to do this. So I would say decentralization is important for Liberian democracy and also devolution. So I think the three things we get from here: power of the people, power of institutions, hard institutions and soft institutions, and power of the Constitution.
Thank you, Jackie. And let me come to you, Jusu. And for you, let us look at, things like voter registration. I know Jackie lay emphasis on the issue of decentralization, how the cities and the counties are in charge of the conduct of the election, the states as well. But let's look at the issue of, voter registration. The way voter registration is done in Liberia and the way it's done here, what can we learn and how can we improve how it is done in Liberia?
Well, I would like to go back on the two previous speakers, for some of the suggestions they were making for Liberia, lesson learned from the US system. The first speaker talked about sometimes people flirting with the idea of having electoral college. Of course, we know that's not going to work in Liberia. I mean, it could if the people wanted it, they push for it, but I don't know if they really understand the nitty-gritty of that. But let's say if it were there, and why would it, help, and what are the pros and cons? I'm always kind of skeptical about the whole idea of the imperial presidency in Liberia. The president is so powerful, and like the second sister said, it's all about the president almost appoint every government official everywhere, city mayor, superintendent, everybody is answerable to the president, thereby making the president to sit like some god on the throne, and for me, that is so scary in as much we have a democracy where people go and every vote counts in Liberia, which is very important. But I think if we can change the system where the president doesn't have that much power, where we give a lot of power to the counties, that will really help to kind of have some check and balances. But like every other speaker said, we need the institutions to be very strong, because we could only be very, we could be kind of verbal with this thing, but in the absence of a strong institution, how do we go about implementing those? It would just be like a toothless bulldog. So as for your question for voter registration, I don't know, Liberia, if I can remember, they have a period for voter registration where everybody have to register within that period of time. And when that time is out, it is out. I don't know if during the elections, if people who didn't register, because they will have to match your name with the name, with the roster. If you came to vote, they will have to find you in there, because I voted in Liberia before and they had to literally look for my name. And I could not vote no other place but where I register, because that's the only place that I have my name. And after I voted, they kind of put some indelible ink on my finger at the time, And so I couldn't go nowhere else to vote, at least if I was not, coin enough to go remove it and come back again and to vote. So I think our voter registration process is something, if the United States were emulating that from us, I'm sure most of the crime that was going on here wouldn't take place. And it's because here you were hearing people talking about people going to vote and they don't have ID. And people were talking about they went there in the droves, they cannot even be identified. You cannot even tell who is who, but they were all voting, So those information, when they reached me, I was like, are you kidding me? Somebody going to vote in the United States and don't have ID. But then if you look at the history of that, there were some minorities who were not able to obtain those IDs. So it just goes down the wrong and find out most of the problem that led to this kind of situation in the first place. Every vote should be counted. Everybody who is a U.S. citizen should be heard in a election, because like the sister said, it is the only time that they are heard. So I'm sure many people may not agree with me, but I'm sure that's a lesson that America could learn from Liberia. Why could Liberia learn from America? I see you smiling.
So I have to come back, but are you saying that there are instances where some individuals appear at a voting place and they have no identification whatsoever? They didn't even call their social security number, and they were allowed to vote just by them showing their faces. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, there were those things coming in as a lot of complaints from different places, and quite frankly, it kind of bad for me. I couldn't just fathom them. Like, you mean the United States, somebody will appear and they don't have voter ID? They don't have an ID or state ID and they still go and vote? How can that even happen?
Well, how would they do that? How would they do that when they had Republican and Democrat observers? Because when I went to vote, they were right there. There was a Republican observer and a Democrat observer at the door. Not to see how you vote, but they look at you and they ask you for your name and everything. So are you telling me that there were some polling booths where they were not observers?
I heard those information from California and Texas.
Okay,
I read them, and I could pull up some stories that were talking about that.
All right, Yusuf, thank you. Let's leave it there. We have a very short time.
I was disputing those myself. I was like, how could that even be? So if that is the case, then I think Liberia is way on top in terms of their voter registration process.
Thank you, Yusuf. Because of time, let me speed it a little bit. And let me bring formula.
Let me conclude on the first part of it.
Okay.
Which is our pre-election. Let me ask the final question, then we move on to the next. Mm-hmm. And the question on that will have to do with other things that took place before the election, which we have the mail-in ballots, we have absentee voting, sometimes it occurs during the election, we have early voting, and also we look at, Ansoni asked about the election voter registration, but other things, materials, the resources or the preparedness of the in Liberia's election commission. Here will be our county officials or the election officials. Let's look at their preparedness, the mail-in ballots, how these things help with the election or harm the election or hurt parties. Let's look at that in a minute, especially the election, the materials, the mail-in ballots, and everything in between. Let me start with you, Carl.
So one of the things I want to point out, I think we cannot overemphasize this, is that there is not a uniform process for how people vote in this country, in the United States. Each state, we have to keep focused on the fact that this is a federal government, and each state, it has a certain level of autonomy. Part of the autonomy for each state is determining the criteria, as long as it's the minimum criteria is for what the Constitution requires. So you cannot restrict people more than what the Constitution says. But each state has a different process. They have different technology. They have different requirements as far as what types of identification you must present. So that's important to note. I cannot overemphasize that. Liberia has one process, one system, one centralized order. So you will not see those discrepancies from one county. You shouldn't see those discrepancies from one county to another. So I just wanted to point that out, to kind of piggyback off of what Juicy was saying. To my knowledge, there is no state in the union that allows someone to vote without an identification. So including Texas, I'm very much aware of the process in Texas, in all the southern states. You do have to have identification before you can cast a ballot, and you must prove your citizenship before you can register to vote in every state in the country. I'm sorry, Dennis, you asked a specific question, but I just found it necessary to address that.
No, that's fine. So let's talk about the other pre-election things that went on with the mail-in ballots, the early voting, the election resources that are things that are used for us to be able to have an election or cast our votes.
So yeah, this election was unique in that, we have coronavirus ravaging the country. And so a lot of Democrats, Democratic activists in the South pushed this early voting thing on a lot of people, especially elderly people, people who are traditionally not able to go to the ballots, or people who might be ill and not want to have extra exposure to coronavirus. And I believe from how it played out, that had an effect on the outcome in South Carolina and Texas and Florida, because many of those votes were not counted. It almost happened in Georgia as well. So you have Democrats heavily voting early by mail-in ballots. And so those votes are more easily disqualified than actually showing up at the polls. So one of the things that we tried to do in Georgia, while you had a lot of Democratic activists telling their people, oh, vote early, get it done, we were looking ahead and saying, yeah, but the state has never had this volume of early voters by mail. They're not going to have the capacity to count these ballots. And they're going to be looking, some of these counties are going to be, possibly, casting these ballots aside as invalid because they don't have enough time to validate them. And so we were telling people, go and vote at the early voting places where you know for a fact that your vote, you've been identified, you've cast your ballot appropriately. And it almost played out in Georgia the way it played out in other places. But this election was unique. I don't think there's any state that's ever had anywhere close to this volume of mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots used to be reserved for people who were living overseas, and you couldn't mail your ballot in if there was nothing wrong with you, if you were present in the state. So I think that affected the outcome. I think more Democrats had their votes disenfranchised because they were overwhelmingly voting in an unconventional manner.
And just so you can come in, we're instituting absentee ballots, mail-in, and then also equipping our election commission with resources. Would that help in Liberia?
And just if I may add to that, the issue of voting machine, the machines here too that are used are very helpful. Is that something that we can learn from the U.S. election and see how that can be applied in Liberia as well?
Which state's machines are you talking about?
If you look at...
Because Florida doesn't have machines. I'm sorry, I just want to get clear. Sorry to interrupt. What state's machines are you talking about?
Oh, well, in my state of Minnesota, when you cast your ballot, you insert it in the machine. And my understanding is that the machine calculates automatically and then brings out the result.
Mm-hmm. Just keep in mind that when we talk about voting machines, people in each state vote differently.
Right. Okay. We're just talking about the election resources in general.
Right. Okay. Technology will always be, it's always required to make the job more, efficient. And if that was in Liberia, that would be good. But that Liberia is kind of a resource limited setting. So most times they are constrained, because of the lack of resources to be able to execute those kind of, good technological support on their side. If it was to be in Liberia, of course, it would be very important. Liberia is still ongoing. If I'm not mistaken, they are still trying to get their entire biometric system in play, which is not even countrywide yet. They're still trying to make sure they can have a good count of their own citizens and that kind of thing. So there is still some shortfalls. As far as election, I think Liberia's system right now for the population and what have been happening over the years, I think it has been very much efficient and provided a more certain, result that reflect the will of the people. For the first time in my life, at least, we were able to see a peaceful transition of power, from Ellen to George. That was a big, case to rejoice about. So Liberia is really doing well in those areas. Do they really need a lot of help to be able to do more? Yes. and introducing technology to the equation will help. Yes, of course. I mean, there is always room for growth. But I think our system, the way it is designed, I'm sure Liberia is really on course to continue to reflect the true will of the people during elections.
Jackie, we have other issues like they call in Liberia, say voter trucking, where Dennis Jack can register in Bannersville, and I can go across the bridge in Bombay and still register. And other issues that come with it. And talking about election materials, like even here before, in other states, before you vote, they sent you a sample ballot. This is how you're going to look, this what you're going to do, this what you expected. In other areas, like again, I say about the absentee or the early voting, will that work? Or do we have just one day in Liberia, we do everything? Or if you can get to my people all the way in Bokondre, can we have something like mail in or do something else? Or can we leapfrog and use our cell phone, maybe some form of technology that we can think of now that may help?
I think some form of technology might work, but now is not the time. I was home when they were registering voters the last time. I was in Barnesville, and I mean, people were in line, and then they ran out of some booklet. Then you stand there, they take your picture against the wall, but nothing stops you from going somewhere else, you know, because I didn't see them asking really for any kind of ID, you know, but so nothing stops you from going. I think that education, you know, I think that they really need to educate the average voter, because they some of them don't know how ballots look. Some of them, you know, some of them may be their first time voting. Some of them, you know, like they might not be able to get to the polls. I think that in Liberia, we need more civic education. We need to educate our people. And one thing about the elections that I see is that I think that debates should be mandated. I think people should be able to debate, so you can remember last time I was here, I talked about truth. What is your truth? And you have to find your truth, because the tyrants always have another version of truth. So I think debates should be mandated. It is a common code of conduct. You have to vote, but you must also listen to the both sides to determine how you will vote. Liberia is resource poor, we know that, so we can't have biometric electronic state of the art. But Liberia is also a country with a small population. So that means that, you know, people can be on site. You know, I always wondered, you know, how they got the ballots to Maryland. Did they get to Maryland? Did they get everywhere in Maryland? How did people vote in Maryland? Those are things that I always wonder about. Another thing is that, you know, we always tend to, when we're voting, we tend to put so much emphasis also on observers, you know? Oh, they come in and they say, oh, the election is free and fair. And we say, oh, yeah, it's free and fair. But we saw that when John Kerry said that if the election was free and fair in Kenya, the Kenyan government, the Kenyan judges came and said, no, it wasn't. It wasn't free and fair. So we should be very careful about these observers as well, telling us that our vote, you know, this is how we're going to interpret it. Anthony, just to take it further, I was in Zambia at the last election, and a lot of the African Union observers, they were at the hotel in a swimming pool, and then they would get some result, and then they would run to their phone. They were not observing. But look at it the other way. Look at not this election, but I think 2 elections ago in Ghana. Look what happened if you watch that documentary, An African Election, right? It came down to one town. And what happened? The people went under the street light, and the entire town made a circle, and they counted the ballot, and everybody went 1, 2, 3. And when they were satisfied with the number, they said you can go, because it's not the voting where the fraud takes place, it's the counting. That's where the fraud takes place.
That's right.
It's not the voting. You can be there, you watch the people vote and say, oh, it's free and fair. It is the counting. Right. So when that Ghanaian town, they were able to say, okay, there are 3,800 votes here. That was it. You can take it wherever you want. We know the number. So I think that at the counting, there should be, you know, people from all parties involved there. So I think that I agree with Jusu in that I think that the voting process is fine, but in the counting is where I think that there's room for improvement.
So
all right.
About counting, let's go. What happened on elections day? Yeah, Sumi, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there is something I want us to look at before we go to during the election. And it is this issue about the voter registration. In Liberia, you have to have a voter registration card. It is that card you only use only for voting. And
Right.
here in the US, if you have your driver license, your state ID, with that, you can register. If you don't have it, they ask for your social security number. In Liberia, my understanding is that now every voter has something, some form of government issue or number or ID card that we can reference to identify the person. We don't have it. Usually we're talking about the biometric ID system they started. I think across the board, every voting adult should have, if not a social security number, then they should have, or either a driver license or state ID, so that when they show up to register, we only document their name along with that number on that ID card. But to just have that voter registration card, I mean, it's like if you lost it, you have to get a new one. I think that is too much because there's no reference point for that.
I want to come in and just a quick point of clarification. Sorry.
Yeah.
So one of we're kind of tiptoeing around the big issue in Liberia is that Liberia doesn't know who their citizens are.
Fine.
People are born still in 2020 without any record of their birth. People die with no record of their birth. The government, to this day, does not properly track or count their citizens. We have not had as the Constitution requires, we have not had a census. I think we're 2 years late on the census. Yeah. Most children are not named properly, and people can just change their names when they start school. I'll give you a very specific example. When you go in Liberia, before I made this change, you could just go to the Ministry of Transport, which is a government agency, and you could just pay without any supporting documentation, and they would issue a driver's license to you. Well, a driver's license is issued by the government, so that legitimizes your presence in the country. If you were a recent immigrant, and we had people from UN who were not even immigrants, that were Nigerians or even Bangladeshis who would come to Liberia, were not entitled to have local driver's licenses. They were supposed to drive on UN licenses. They would just go to the Ministry of Transport and literally buy a license. No tracking system, no checks and balances. We had to implement systems where if you were an immigrant, you had to first come with because the Ministry of Transport could not be the first point of contact for an immigrant coming to the country. You had to go to immigration, obtain documentation that you were lawfully in the country before getting a driver's license. I mean, simple things that seem to be common sense were not in place. Children start school. There's no requirement that children have birth certificates before they start school. This is important. These are things that should be in place. So we're talking about registering voters in a country that doesn't even track its citizens. So there is a lot of problems in Liberia when it comes to registering people to vote, because you could be, from Guinea, like my cousins. I have a lot of relatives in Guinea because I'm from a border town. And, so there's a lot of Mono people on the other side of the St. John River that are related to me. And those people, they don't vote in Liberia, but they could. They could very well just walk across the bridge and register to vote. Yeah. And that is the big problem in Liberia. So we're talking about democracy. The idea that the identification of citizens isn't even, being done. That's the bigger issue. And so when you talk about, somebody getting a voter ID card, it doesn't mean anything. It's completely meaningless, because the criteria to get the voter registration card is frivolous. Sometimes, and then the worst part, if you are a member of a certain ethnic group, like if you're Madingo or Fula, you were born in Liberia, maybe you spent time in Guinea during the war, so you picked up a strong Guinean accent, but you're a Liberian citizen, they will deny you the right to vote because of your accent, arbitrarily. And, there's a lot of nonsense that goes on in that country. So the system of actually identifying and forcing people to register themselves at birth, their children at birth, should be the first thing to the integrity of registering people to vote. That should be the first step.
Just to interrupt, earlier I talked about ID being required to vote in the U.S. So I was sort of put up two states, that's California and D.C., and they say, according to the Office of the California Secretary of State, in most cases, California voters are now required to show identification at their polling place. And then for D.C., it says D.C. does not require identification from most voters. So maybe if you break those, I mean, if we went deep into this, we could find out which voters are not required and which are required, and which one is the, in most cases in California, we could, but I know I kind of came across the kind of story. That's why I was commenting earlier.
It's more important to talk about registration. What's the process of registration? That should be the first question. Because if you've already registered and you go to your polling place and you can give them your social and you can give them enough information for them to know it's you, they should not deny you the vote.
Right. And these issues have always been there. I remember this has always been in the news, that are requiring ID at voter registry or at a time of voting. For some, those have been strategies used in the past for voter suppression. So it is not uncommon to have that. It's not just happening this year. It happened last year. I mean, the last election and elections before, that some states do not require that for you to vote. And as Carl said, it is important what happens during voter registration, what is required. So if that is already required, we can use any piece of personal identifiable information to get you to vote. So let's move on quickly to during elections. And a lot of you already talked about counting. During the elections, we saw people are standing in line, people are voting, the length of time it takes. And for some, using machine, you punch things in, you print it out, and you put it in a voter machine. For some, probably paper ballot. Mr. Sia, do we have an interruption in the show?
No, you're live. That's what I see here.
Oh, okay. All right, so let's go on the day of election, voting itself, and we see that reports were being given out of the voting areas, so people are, and then the role of the media, we have observers. Give me your feedback on what happened on the actual elections day and what can we learn from that? Let's start with Jackie.
Well, the lesson learned is just that nothing is final until it is final, right? I know that, well, my daughter voted by mail, and I spoke to one of my friends who is a Republican, and he said to me, I'm not voting by mail because when you vote on voting day, it's counted right away.
That's
so
right.
Of course, the president said, don't vote by ballots. So a lot of Republicans voted on election day. So of course, then there's this inflated number. So you say, okay, this inflated number, so it's for this person. But then when the mail-in ballots come in, of course, then things shift. I think the lesson learned is exactly what Kau said, that the volume of mail-in ballots, there were some states that were unable to cope, with the counting. I think that that people were rejoicing too hastily when they were counting and things were in their favor. I think that the lesson learned is that you can never determine how things are going to go. And I will say that, it's never right to easily concede. So nobody should do that, to concede so hastily, because if you concede and then they count the votes and then you're ahead, you've already conceded. I don't know if there's a time where you can backtrack and say, no, it's in my favor. So I'm glad that Biden didn't concede at the beginning, that he waited and things shifted. And I will say that the mail-in ballot saved the day, along with Stacey Abrams. So I don't know how it can be brought to Liberia, because we don't do mail-in ballots now. I would say the mail-in ballots are even when they come from Maryland, they are counted in Maryland. They are not counted. They're not brought to Monrovia and counted.
Right.
So I think that to ensure that the process is free, fair, and transparent, we should have all parties involved there at the counting. And I think just, hope for the best.
Exit polling, Jusu, on the day of the election, we see that people are at the place there kind of reporting as people come out of the voting booths. They ask them who you voted for, and based on that, people are able to make some early projections.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like Sis Jackie said earlier, most of the Republican voters voted on elections day. So exit polling will kind of lean in their favor because those are the people who were there, standing and voting and coming out and giving feedback to the reporters. The COVID factor this year really, exposed a different phenomenon altogether. I think a lot of people jump on the whole mail-in ballots thing because of the whole virus thing. I'm sure this is the first time mail-in ballot has such a huge volume in this country. So we don't know we all pray COVID will be gone very soon. So we may not have that. But I was more concerned about state law about the mail-in ballots. I would encourage them if they were to start to count those ballots ahead of time. We go 4 years and you are waiting for this one big day called Elections Day, which kind of epitomizes the whole democratic process for the smooth transition of power. I think there should be a lot of resources in there that people should be able to just work to have this transparency so that we do away with all these things that are going on today. I believe if those ballots were counted prior to Elections Day and those results released on Election Day, we wouldn't have most of what we are going through right now. I don't think we are going up to Saturday to have this kind of unofficial result coming in. That would have been done by Tuesday night. Because that was a huge fault.
Just to inject before you land, there were laws. The states, the states wanted to do that, but the House of Representatives stopped them. Like in Pennsylvania, it also happened in Nevada. So these are laws because from what they are saying, since the Republicans did not favor the mail-in ballots, so they stopped that so that on the day of of voting, they could kind of use that those were fraud, because if they don't create that doubt and then it causes the elections announcing the results to last so long, and then you use that to instill some fear or lies into it that this thing did not really.
I don't know if because of course the Pennsylvania case was the hottest case in the news about what was happening between the legislature and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The legislature gave one. The legislators were on one side and the Supreme Court was on the other side. Whatever side they were on for it, I was more concerned about the counting of the ballot, because the volume was so huge. So regardless of if we're going to be counting we're going to be accepting postmarked ballot 3 days after election, or if we're going to be accepting it by Election Day, I believe they should have started counting that thing ever since to be able to just reduce the workload on Elections Day so that they can be able to give that result. That's what I was more concerned about. Because if you want to be transparent, as soon as there is a little loophole or something, everybody think that, hey, there is something happening. But I knew that in the end, if you take a case to the Supreme Court, in the end, the Supreme Court is going to look at that case and say, look, we want to know if what happened was so grave enough that it will stop who's winning from winning, in my own little man's talk, So in the end, the ballots have to be counted, whether they were counted before or after. I support that they all should be counted. So the whole thing about stop counting, I don't know who want to do that, because American citizens vote. Everybody's voices should be heard through their ballot, So, but I think they can be able to modify that another time in order to just alleviate some of these trouble that went on this time around, But all in all, I think the pandemic added to it, and we don't think that it's going to be around during the next election. So I think we will have a smooth sail.
Carl?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the inauguration is in January for a reason. The president the new president-elect doesn't take office until January for a reason. The reason is it gives you time to count the ballots, to handle any disputes. You don't inaugurate the president on November 4th or 5th or 6th. You don't inaugurate the president before Christmas, all the way January 1. So there's no law that says because election day is January, the first Tuesday in January, that we have to have the results. The first Tuesday in November, that we have to have the results the first Wednesday in November. So there's nothing strange about it. I mean, we had, Al Gore and George W. Bush. I mean, we've had many, many cases throughout history where the president-elect is announced several weeks after the first Tuesday of November. So I think there's nothing wrong with waiting until the election day to start counting ballots. I think that's the process that's been set up, and it's a constitutional process. So the states were correct to say don't count the ballots ahead of time before people vote. There's so many reasons why. There could be undue influence. If you start counting ballots early, it just opens up a whole can of worms that's unnecessary. So the waiting and ensuring that things are done, I don't see a problem with it. The other thing is a lot of these mail-in ballots have to be counted by hand. That delays things a lot. Throughout most of the history of the United States, ballots have been counted manually. We talk about technology, we talk about all of this stuff. You cannot automate or put technology in a situation where there's no system and there's no process. Every automation, every computerized system you see in the United States was taken from manual processes, and those were converted over to electronic systems. So when you compare that to Liberia, where you lack systems altogether, you don't have a system where as soon as a child is born, the parents have to sign a birth certificate and we have to have the child's name on record. If you bring automation to a country that doesn't register children at birth, what difference is it going to make? What are you automating? We talk about decentralization. If you have no system to decentralize, what difference will it make? You have to organize before you decentralize. Otherwise, you'll be decentralizing dysfunction. You have to be organized before you automate. Otherwise, you'll be automating dysfunction. So the issue here is not technology. It is an understanding of having a proper system by which things are done and put in place. We don't have a lot of money, but we do have the information necessary to know that we should organize filing systems, we should organize processes by which if a child is born, this is the next step. Those things can be done relatively affordably. And you need to just adopt a culture of having systems in place. Down the road, you can then automate those systems. But the introduction of technology to a place that has no systems in place is not going to help. It's not going to do anything. Technology doesn't organize things for you. It automates things that you have already organized. So I just needed to make that point. In the United States, if all the technology goes away, people know how to file. There's a process by which you count ballots. All of these things are already in place.
Right, and technology has its own drawbacks. But let's move to our final segment of the night. That's after elections. That's the period we're in now. After elections, of course, we touch on the counting of the ballots. We talk about results and projections. We talk about the actions of party leaders during the counting process, the final unofficial results. And sometimes people look at this one, the projection, because normally we get the result on election night and party starts and everything is fine. So this is not the first time. So at the time they are giving this result on Tuesday night, the counting is not finished, but they're able to do projections. Most of the time it worked that way. And after election, what do we see? We see the concession speech and we see victory speech. This, I don't know if we're going to get both this year, but what's your reaction? And let's start with Jusu this time. And then this will be our final point for the night. Well,
I was just reading the news that Rudy from former New York guy, Giuliani, was saying that Trump would not concede, I know they do have a lot of legal process going on. Maybe they want to make sure they can see the end of those legal process before you can give the concession speech, I don't know if anything anything really going to change that much, you know. For me, elections time are always a time of, you know, tenseness. Everyone is tense. Everybody is at one another's throat, and that's normal. That's okay, you know. But there is time for everything, like our good old book say, you know. When this time is done, everybody should just try to go their way and go to work on Monday morning. Everybody start their life, and life goes on, you know. So I don't know how far these people are going to continue to hold on for giving concession speech, number one. Number two, I don't know if concession speech is required in order for president-elect to take their seat. You know, I don't know whether it's a constitutional requirement. I think it's just courtesy. It's just about being courteous, you know, to say, hey, thank you. We went in a race and you won. And so, but I don't think it's a constitutional requirement for a president-elect to be able to take their seat. So we're going to watch and see. We know, you know, elections bring their own drama. We're going to see quite a few going on, especially as the legal process go on. But in the end, I believe everything will die down. For those people who were in the United States during Al Gore and W. Bush, I'm sure there was such a tense moment at the time. Even 2016, after the election, we saw how tense it was, you know. But in the end, everybody got a life to live. People got a family to take care of, you know, and life goes on until we wait for the next 4 years. I'm sure political parties will start to strategize. The Republicans did very well. They pick up, you know, a few seats in the House. I'm sure they will just have to go back to that war room and say, hey, what can we do to be better this time to be able to secure the executive? I'm sure that's where they need to start now. So I don't think they want to waste time on this concession. They need to start making that groundwork now to see how they can move forward.
And Jackie, let me bring you in, but let me just throw in one thing. 2016, President Kennedy Trump said, I'm only going to accept this election only when I win. And so this is not out of the ordinary that he's not able to concede this time. Jackie.
So, you know, the guardrails of democracy, right? We have the hard ones, like we said before, and we have the soft ones. And the soft ones are what? They are accepted and collective standards, norms of conduct, right? They are not written down, right? But they are shared codes of conduct. So you say, oh, it's not mandated that you should give a concession speech, but it is the norm. It is good, you know, to say, you know what, the best person won, right? So there's mutual toleration and willingness to avoid actions that will hurt democracy is something that is completely lacking, you know, in this former president. You know, there is nothing wrong with conceding, you know, if you know that you've been beaten. So with the concession speech, I agree that it's not mandated, but that doesn't mean that it's not an accepted norm of behavior that you should do that, right? So the second thing I would say about, sorry, I lost my train of thought. What was the question again, Dennis?
The post-election, so we're talking about projections, the reactions, the concession speech, the victory speech, and the celebration that followed.
Yeah, for me, you know, last time I was on and we're talking, I said that for me, the election was vitally important because I was really interested in the election because of Africa. And people said, well, what does this have to do? And I talked about the Ethiopian dam. And I talked about different things that were on the table that were slated to be cut. I think that good has righted itself. Let me put it that way. We talked about the common good for the world. And I think that although President Biden has a lot of work to do, I feel that countries will move forward. Countries will heal. I feel that, as you can see, the Secret Service have already started going to Biden's house. And it shows you that the allegiance is not to the person. The allegiance is to the office. And that is how it should be. You know, if it's so Liberians should learn that, you know, it's not the person who occupies the seat. It is the seat that you should protect at all costs. It is the seat. It is that office that you should protect. And I think that, for me, I think that education is vitally important in Africa, for our voters, you know, that we should do civic education. I think that the world will heal I think 4 years is too short, but the world will heal. I don't think that Trump is going to give a concession speech, like I said before, but I also think that as we move forward, I think that now the United States will have a better time to beat COVID by respecting science, and the doctors. And so I'm very optimistic about this new era in this country and in the world.
Thank you. Carl?
Yeah, so I'm an independent because I understand that, fundamentally, the Democrats and the Republicans agree on more things than they disagree on. And as an African, my loyalty first and foremost is to African people, whether they be citizens of the United States or citizens of Liberia. And so in this particular election, I did not support Donald Trump, not because he's a Republican, not because he is, but because he's a representation of the European quest for privilege, undue privilege, and supremacy over the rest of the world. And I think we as Africans, we like to forget that there is a multi-generational attack upon our person and our right to live and exist in this world free of oppression and exploitation. It still continues in 2020. When you see groves of people voting for a person who's vile and ignorant and disrespectful, and you see groves of European Americans, and Europeans around the world, honestly, the ones who were all for Brexit and all this nonsense, supporting such a character. It has absolutely nothing to do with religion. They're trying to conserve their position of unearned privilege in this world. And that is why I went against Trump and did what I could in my weak way to conscientize people, especially African Christians who wrongfully aligned with people who are fundamentally against their interests on simple issues that have absolutely nothing to do with the presidency. Simple issues like abortion rights, which are state issues, and religious issues that have absolutely nothing to do with the presidency. And these people are the ones that I targeted as far as being able to give information to and enlighten and say, listen to me. When you and your children have been denied certain rights to exist, coexist, and have fair and equal opportunities to live lives free from exploitation because you are concerned about someone being homosexual and living and cohabitating together, which is more important? That's what a Trump presidency represents. He has absolutely no control over who's going to abort babies or if someone's gay or not. That's ridiculous. But for some reason, they were able to align themselves with quite a number of people who were well-meaning people religiously, right? Who thought that for some reason, because their religion was guiding them, that they should align themselves with a person who is supported by the Ku Klux Klan and hate groups. This is the real issue. And this is why I'm celebrating tonight for myself and my children, not because I'm a Democrat, but because I'm an African. And I understand the profound impact another 4 years of a white supremacist would have had upon my children and their future.
Thank you. And that's a very important point on the religious part. And we're definitely going to do a separate show on this whole Christianity lining or Christians lining behind someone you described in those terms. Anthony, I think we got everything we needed tonight.
We got everything we needed tonight and within an hour. And that is good because we don't want to keep our panelists that long. But I want to make my own contribution on the last point about the issue of consensus statement from the losing candidate. Donald Trump did lose, and he needs to recognize that. And it is a tradition in democracy, especially in election, that if you don't win, you have to concede graciously, because that is the climax of what we call democracy. That is the beauty of it. But for this man who received similar grace from, Hillary Clinton, who he defeated narrowly, and he felt good about it and not willing to do it for Joe Biden. I mean, it is not for Joe Biden per se, but that is how you respect the voters. They have made their decision. They made a decision in the past that brought you to power. You had your 4 years, and now they have made another decision. His unwillingness to concede, and it's more like disrespecting the decision that has been made by the American people. And this is Trump again, trying to show to people that it is all about him and the people don't matter. The people matter. Had it not been because of the people, he would not have been president in the first place. Given what we know him to be, there's a bully of a person who has no respect for humanity and decency whatsoever. So he needs to respect that norm. It is very, very important. Even though it's not a constitutional requirement, it is a norm that is required for democracy to be at its climax, and he needs to do that. If he doesn't do that, shame on him and also those who support him. And I'm not going to have my feelings about that, because that is democracy. That is the ending. That is the movement we all need to enjoy. And Trump is trying to rob us of that, and it's just, completely out of line. Dennis?
On that note, we want to end the broadcast. That's the typical, as soon as CM making his voice heard tonight. Panelists, we want to thank you so much for your time. I know on this Saturday, you should have been somewhere enjoying your weekend, but we thank you so much for, definitely we're going to always have you back. We enjoy your participation. I want to thank all our audience, our viewers, and even those who are going to watch later. We appreciate you, and you have time now to go and listen to the speech of President-elect Biden. Yeah. On that note, we're going to be ending with our normal song, our usual song that says, "We are all Liberians." Whether you voted for Trump, Biden, or the Libertarian, we are all Liberians, and let's do whatever it takes to make Liberia that glorious land of liberty that we all dream of.